Man who catch fly with chopstick accomplish anything.
He wasn't just playing a role, he was the heartbeat of the Karate Kid, the quiet mentor, the wise guide whose words seemed to leap off the screen and settle into the hearts of an entire generation. But here's the twist. The real man behind Mr. Miyagi couldn't have been more different. Pat Morita's own life was anything but calm. It was stormy, filled with rejection, doubt, and personal battles that the cameras never showed. And yet, before he passed away, Morita finally chose to break his silence. For the very first time, he revealed what really happened behind the scenes and why the truth had been buried for so many years. His confession wasn't about the crane kick or the fight choreography or the lines everyone remembers. It was something far deeper, something that almost kept him from becoming Miyagi at all. So here's the question. What secret did Pat Morita carry for all those years? And why did he wait until the very end to finally tell it? When audiences think of the Karate Kid, their minds immediately go to Mr. Miyagi, the quiet handyman with a piercing gaze, few words, and a gentle strength that guided Daniel LaRusso through every obstacle. Miyagi wasn't just a teacher, he was a father figure, a protector, and a living embodiment of wisdom. But what fans never knew, until Pat himself finally spoke, is that the man who became Miyagi almost never got the role. Because in the beginning, Hollywood didn't believe in him. One of the most powerful men in the industry at that time, producer Jerry Weintraub, was determined to block him from stepping into Miyagi's shoes. You see, Pat Morita wasn't considered a serious actor. To most people in Hollywood, he was simply a comic. Audiences remembered him for his one-liners on TV, his effortless timing, and his light-hearted roles that made people laugh. He was charming, yes, but could he possibly transform into a war-hardened, emotionally scarred mentor? Could a comedy really become a man of quiet tragedy and wisdom? Weintraub didn't think so. When Morita's name first came up in casting discussions, it was immediately shot down. The story goes that Weintraub dismissed it outright, saying he didn't want a comic anywhere near the part. He demanded gravitas. He wanted a heavyweight, someone with the kind of presence that would convince audiences Miyagi was the real deal. And just like that, a wall went up in front of Pat Morita. Every time his name resurfaced, Weintraub knocked it back down. To him, America was overflowing with actors who fit the part better. Casting directors scrambled, flipping through headshots, calling in audition after audition, searching for the man who could embody the soul of Miyagi. They wanted someone who looked right, sounded right, and carried the kind of Hollywood pedigree Weintraub trusted. And for weeks, that wall held strong. Pat Morita, who would one day deliver one of the most iconic performances in film history, wasn't even allowed in the room. Pat Morita? At first, he wasn't even given the courtesy of a reading. His name wasn't on the list, his face wasn't in the running, and for the producers, he simply didn't fit the picture they had in mind. But fate has a way of turning when you least expect it. And in this case, it turned hard. Director John Avildsen, the same visionary who had already struck gold with Rocky, wasn't interested in traveling down the same old, well-paved road. He knew what made the Karate Kid tick wasn't just the punches, the crane kicks, or the training montages. It was the invisible thread binding teacher and student. That emotional core had to feel real, raw, and undeniable. And Avildsen wasn't about to risk it by cutting corners. So when Weintraub and others dismissed certain names, Avildsen dug in his heels. He insisted that every single candidate be given a shot, no matter how unlikely, no matter how strongly the producer shook his head. That determination cracked the door open just enough for Pat Morita to step in. Years later, Morita would describe it as almost surreal, being lumped into what he called the cattle call, standing shoulder to shoulder with names the studio actually wanted, while he himself was nothing more than an afterthought. In fact, by the time his turn came, he was the very last actor they brought in. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same man Jerry Weintraub had dismissed outright was suddenly sitting across the table, reading lines, all because Avildsen refused to let the opportunity slip away. For Marita, this wasn't just another audition. This was a crack in the wall he'd been banging his head against for years. After bouncing from small television appearances to stand-up comedy gigs, after being typecast and overlooked, this moment felt like a lifeline, a chance he was never supposed to have. And it taught him something he carried with him forever. Hollywood is nothing if not unpredictable. One day you wrap from yet another job that no one will remember, and the very next, a door swings open that changes your entire life. When audiences later fell in love with Mr. Miyagi, when the character became immortal, few remembered that once upon a time, in those tense early casting sessions, the role almost slipped away before it began. But Morita never forgot. In later interviews, he spoke with disarming honesty about that fragile chapter. He admitted that Weintraub's refusal to even consider him nearly destroyed the project before it left the ground. And he never hesitated to credit John Avildsen's stubbornness with saving him, not just as an actor, but as a man who had one last chance to show the world who he was. One fleeting judgment call, one quick dismissal from an executive, that single instant changed everything. Had Avildsen not stood his ground, Pat Morita might never have stepped foot into that audition room. And without Marita, without his quiet warmth, humor, and wisdom, the Karate Kid would never have become the story the world embraced. The wall he was forced to face in that moment wasn't just about Hollywood politics. It was about the very survival of his artistic soul. And as Pat would later joke with a sly smile, walls weren't meant to be stared at. They were meant to be climbed, broken, or chopped through. But the man who eventually walked into that room was not the Pat Morita audiences thought they knew. Gone was the sharp, clean-cut comedian from the television sets of the 70s. In his place stood someone entirely different. Bearded, weary, almost unrecognizable. A version of himself he hadn't fully met before. This wasn't a slick performer looking for laughs. This was a man shaped by struggle, carrying the weight of disappointment, and freshly returned from Hawaii, where survival, not stardom, had been his reality. By the early 1980s, Pat's career was in a fog. He had known success before, stand-up comedy gigs, guest spots, and of course, the beloved role on Happy Days. But the offers had thinned, the spotlight dimmed. Instead of chasing the Hollywood machine, he drifted thousands of miles away to Hawaii, where the work was modest and often far from glamorous. He emceed political fundraisers, he scribbled ad copy for commercials, he took nightclub gigs whenever he could. It wasn't fame, it wasn't steady, but it was enough to keep life moving forward. To the outside world, it looked like Pat Morita was fading quietly, his career easing toward its end. To him, it felt like being stuck in place, treading water, waiting for something, anything to break. And then, in the middle of that uncertainty, came a decision that would transform not only his look, but his entire presence. For the first time in his life, he allowed his hair and beard to grow out. Not for a role, not for a show, not because anyone told him to. Simply because, deep down, he felt it was time to change. Pat would later laugh when looking back at that phase of his life, joking that with his long hair and scruffy beard, he looked more like a wandering hippie than a polished actor. But in truth, at the time, he couldn't have cared less about appearances. He wasn't chasing casting directors, wasn't trying to look sharp for auditions, and certainly wasn't worried about fitting into Hollywood's glossy mold. He was simply existing, drifting through a chapter of uncertainty, and allowing his appearance to reflect exactly where he was, rough around the edges, unsettled, unpolished. That beard, wild, uneven, and completely unlike the clean-cut image people associated with him, would soon reveal itself to be something far more important than just facial hair. It would become, unknowingly, a stroke of fate. He didn't realize it at the time, but that scruffy look gave him something intangible, a presence. When the opportunity finally came for him to audition for the Karate Kid, the beard transformed him into someone different in the eyes of casting. It made him appear like a man who had endured storms, who carried the weight of wisdom, who seemed older and more grounded than the comedian audiences remembered from his past roles. What began as nothing more than a personal choice quickly became an unplanned gift to his career, an image that whispered of hardship, patience, and quiet strength. Still, behind the image, silence had wrapped itself around Pat's life. It wasn't just the silence of fewer job offers, it was the silence of uncertainty, of a man questioning whether his place in the industry still existed. When his contract with his agent came up for renewal, he very nearly let it die out. He told himself it might be easier to walk away, yet, with a half-hearted shrug, he signed on again almost absent-mindedly, as if saying to himself, "What the hell? Why not?" It felt more like a courtesy than a decision, an act of inertia, not ambition. That same afternoon, as he left his agent's office with no spark of hope and every intention of retreating back to Hawaii, fate decided it had other plans. It did not arrive quietly. It came roaring into his life with the force of a thunderclap. "Pat Morita!" the voice rang out, echoing down the hallway. Startled, Pat turned. The secretary came rushing out, shouting breathlessly that he had just walked out the door. His agent leaned over the railing, waving him back with urgency in his voice. "Pat, get your butt back in here. There's a script I think is perfect for you." That script was The Karate Kid. The whole scene unfolded with such precision, it felt almost scripted itself, as if destiny had grabbed him by the collar and spun him around. Marita would later describe the moment not as something casual or routine, but as surreal, an encounter that felt too perfect to be real, too poetic to be chance. Hollywood often tells stories of fate, but in that instant, Pat Morita was living one. There he was, half in, half out, one foot already angled toward the exit, ready to leave Los Angeles behind for good, carrying the silent acceptance that the city had nothing left for him. No roles waiting, no calls to return, no spotlight searching for his face. He was ready to walk away. And then, as if fate itself had decided to run interference at the very last second, a script found its way into his hands. He opened it. He read. Something stirred. He liked it enough to say yes, yes to an audition with John Avildsen. At the time, it didn't feel like destiny. It didn't feel monumental. It was just another audition, another door he was being told to walk through, another director whose name he barely knew. Nothing more. Or so it seemed. But then came the timing, the beard, the look he hadn't planned but suddenly wore like armor, the strange sequence of chance encounters, shuffled steps, and seemingly insignificant decisions that led him right back through a door he thought had closed forever. All of it. The re-signing with an agent he almost abandoned, the Hawaiian trip that left him looking older, wiser, different, the very sidewalk he happened to be standing on that day, all began to weave into something bigger. Years later, when Pat Morita reflected on that moment, he did not laugh it off as coincidence. No, he spoke of it with awe, almost reverence, as though an unseen hand had nudged him back onto the path he was meant to walk. Because if even one of those things hadn't happened, if he hadn't been in Hawaii, if he hadn't reconnected with his agent, if he hadn't paused on that exact street corner, the opportunity might never have touched him at all. Fortune could have slipped by unnoticed, leaving the role of Mr. Miyagi for someone else, altering movie history forever. And yet, everything converged into one open door. An audition for a role producers swore he wasn't right for, a role they didn't even want him to read. But he walked in anyway. Only the audition wasn't what he expected. He braced for the usual Hollywood gauntlet, assistants shuffling papers, producers scribbling in notebooks, executives whispering judgments from the shadows, maybe even a writer tucked away in the corner. He expected a crowd. Instead, he walked into a room that was nearly empty. Eerily so.
It all began with a single camera test. Not a faceless audition before a panel of skeptics, but a quiet moment under the focused gaze of a director who believed in capturing truth, not just performance. That lens wasn't just recording Pat Morita, it was searching for something deeper, something honest. And soon, the test would grow beyond him alone. He would be paired with a young actor from New York to see if a spark, an authentic connection between student and teacher, could be ignited before their very eyes. For most actors, one good audition is enough to earn a role. But Pat Morita, he had to fight through 5. Even after John Avildsen's tape silenced the doubters and began to turn skeptics into believers, the producers weren't convinced. They needed more proof. They needed to be absolutely certain that this man, who for years had been dismissed as a comic, could transform into the soul of Mr. Miyagi. And so began the gauntlet. 5 separate tests. 5 trials, not just of acting, but of spirit. The first 2 tests were reenactments, designed to answer a single question. Could he summon the same intensity, the same quiet authority, without slipping into parody or comedy? Could he carry Miyagi's weight, his subtle wisdom, his fragile humanity? Each time, Marita delivered. He moved with dignity, spoke with the gravity of a man who had lived 100 untold stories, and revealed flashes of vulnerability that hinted at the depth within Miyagi's silence. But it was the third test that raised the stakes higher than ever. Ralph Macchio flew in from New York. This wasn't just about performance anymore, it was about chemistry. Could the relationship between Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi feel real? Could it carry the heartbeat of the story? The script demanded a bond far greater than student and teacher. It had to be father and son, mentor and guide, protector and friend. If that connection wasn't there, the entire film would collapse before it ever began. At first, it was simple lines, basic dialogues, but soon they dove deeper into the wax-on, wax-off lessons, the raw confessions, the long silences that somehow speak louder than dialogue. And it wasn't just acting. Marita wasn't forcing the connection, he was listening, reacting, guiding. There was a warmth, an authenticity, an ease in the way he opened space for Macchio to lean into him. Slowly, Ralph did just that. He leaned in, not to a co-star, but to a figure he could trust. That was the moment the producers first saw it, the fragile beginning of a partnership that would anchor an entire franchise. And yet, the tests weren't over. The producers wanted more. The 4th test brought in costumes. Could Pat Morita look the part? Could he shed the image of the nightclub comic, the sitcom regular, and step fully into the skin of Mr. Miyagi? They gave him the simplest gi. They let his beard and hair grow into natural signifiers of the character. And in that instant, the transformation was undeniable. The man who had once been known for punchlines was gone. Standing before them was someone else entirely. Mr. Miyagi, flesh and blood. Shaped by the weight of age, the scars of experience, and the quiet ache of a life that had already known loss, Pat Morita stepped forward. In that moment, the man standing there wasn't simply an actor trying to win a role. He was something else entirely. Even Ralph Macchio would confess that the transformation stunned him. Once Pat slipped into Miyagi's clothes, something beyond costume took over. It was no longer Pat in front of them. He became Miyagi, body and soul. He didn't just play the part, he was the part. But in Hollywood, belief wasn't enough. Studio executives weren't satisfied with hints of magic. They wanted certainty, proof upon proof, guarantees stacked on top of guarantees. And so the gauntlet continued. The 5th and final test would be the clincher, the one that stripped away every crutch. No elaborate set to hide behind, no carefully staged props, just a cold, empty soundstage, the harsh hum of overhead lights, and 3 figures: Pat Morita, Ralph Macchio, and the unforgiving eye of a camera. It was the purest kind of stress test. Could the magic survive under conditions this bare, this unforgiving? Could it breathe when everything theatrical was stripped away? The answer revealed itself almost instantly. From the very first exchange, it was as if Ralph and Pat had been speaking to each other in these roles for years. Ralph didn't feel like he was reciting lines anymore. He was responding, naturally, instinctively, to a mentor who stood before him, flesh and blood. And Pat wasn't acting at all. He was inhabiting. Miyagi wasn't performed. It was lived. And when the camera finally clicked off, what followed was not applause, not chatter, not even immediate approval. What filled that soundstage was silence. A silence so heavy, so absolute, it made the truth undeniable. Something extraordinary had just happened. 5 auditions had not only proven that Pat Morita could act, they proved he was the only one who could be Miyagi. No one else even came close. Those grueling trials had forged something beyond a performance. Out of them grew something permanent. Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita were no longer just 2 actors sharing screen time. In that crucible, Ralph became Daniel, and Pat became Miyagi. And the 2 of them, student and teacher, were bonded forever, their chemistry reaching far beyond the set, destined to echo through generations of audiences. The 5 flawless tests made the case undeniable. Morita was Miyagi. And yet, even with all of Hollywood seeing what was clear as day, one final obstacle remained. A voice of doubt, louder than all the others. The decision would come down not to a crowd, but to a single man, the toughest skeptic of them all, Jerry Weintraub. For weeks, Weintraub had been the immovable wall in Morita's path. A powerful producer, respected and feared in equal measure, he couldn't reconcile Pat Morita, the comedian, the sitcom face, with the idea of a wise, deeply human mentor. He didn't trust it. He didn't believe it. And so Morita's future dangled on the sharp edge of Weintraub's hesitation. Then came the moment, the phone call that flipped the room. It happened right after that stark 5th test. Pat and Ralph, this time in costume, had given the studio heads a scene that was anything but flashy. No flying kicks, no swelling orchestral score, just a quiet, unadorned conversation between a boy and his mentor. Miyagi, speaking in the clipped, halting rhythm Pat had carved from instinct, exhaustion, and truth. Daniel leaning in not as an actor with a script, but as a boy reaching for guidance from someone who seemed to truly care. And that, against all odds, was what finally turned the tide. The stillness in that room carried more weight than any explosion or flying kick ever could. John Avildsen, steady and certain in his instincts, simply let the camera roll. He had been Pat Morita's champion from the very start, the one man pushing when others pulled back, the one keeping that audition tape alive, replaying it every time Jerry Weintraub's skepticism tried to bury it. Now the stakes were higher. In front of a full room, it wasn't just Morita on trial. It was Morita and Ralph Macchio standing side by side, teacher and student, undeniable in their chemistry. When the test ended, no one laughed, no one scoffed. The same voices that once dismissed him had nothing left to say. Instead, there was silence, but not just any silence. This was the kind that tips the scale, the kind that tells you everything has just changed. Weintraub reached for the phone. On the other end sat Marita, waiting at home, uncertain if his moment had already slipped through his fingertips. For weeks, he had poured his heart into a role that others insisted wasn't his to play. Now all that weight hung on a single call. Weintraub's words, usually sharp and commanding, came out different this time. They carried humility, even reverence. Pat, I almost made the worst mistake of my life. I just want to be the first to congratulate you. You've got the part of Miyagi. For Morita, it wasn't just about landing a job. It was redemption. It was a chance to prove to everyone who doubted him, to everyone who saw only a comedian, that he was more. He didn't shout, he didn't gloat, he didn't throw their doubts back in their faces. Instead, he let the victory speak for itself. In that single moment, the room that had once looked down on him now stood in respect. Triumph and humility washed over him at once. He knew this wasn't only his win, it was a turning point for the film itself. Mr. Miyagi wasn't just another role. He was destined to be a cultural landmark, a symbol that would outlive the film and outlive them all. With Miyagi cast, everything locked into place. Macchio had his mentor, Avildsen had his heart, and Weintraub had the rare courage to admit when he'd been wrong. That was why the victory was so sweet for Pat, because it wasn't handed to him. He clawed his way through doubt and rejection, and now at last he could step into Mr. Miyagi's shoes with everything he had, Weintraub's humbled confession still echoing in his ears. But even as the role became his, the fight was far from over. Winning the part was one battle. The next would be convincing audiences that Miyagi's broken English wasn't the punchline of a joke, but the poetry of a soul. How Miyagi's voice was born. Securing the role of Mr. Miyagi was one victory. Creating a voice the world would never forget? That would be another. Pat Morita understood one thing better than anyone. The way Miyagi spoke could either give the character life or completely destroy him. The voice wasn't just an accent, it was the soul of the role. If Morita leaned too far into caricature, Miyagi risked becoming another cheap stereotype, the kind Hollywood had recycled for years whenever portraying Asian characters. But if he polished the delivery too much, if it sounded too smooth or perfect, then Miyagi would lose his grounding. He wouldn't feel like the immigrant janitor and war veteran written into the script, a man who had learned English late in life, his words carrying both weight and hesitation. Marita knew he had to strike the perfect balance, dignity without parody, authenticity without mockery. And the irony? The first spark didn't come from over-preparation, it came from sheer exhaustion. During those long early auditions, Morita was drained, worn thin from constantly having to prove himself. His energy dipped so low that his words slowed down, falling into clipped, halting rhythms. He later joked with a wry grin, "That's why Miyagi talks like this." It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. It simply slipped out when Morita was too tired to overthink it. But to John Avildsen and the others watching, it was lightning in a bottle. The cadence didn't feel clownish, it didn't feel forced, it felt true. It sounded like the voice of a man who carried history in his pauses, someone whose silences mattered just as much as his words. From there, Morita honed it with care. He leaned into the character of a man who spoke slowly, deliberately, as if he considered the weight of each word before letting it go. Broken grammar became something more. It became poetry. When Miyagi told Daniel, "A man who catches flies with chopsticks can accomplish anything," audiences didn't hear a punchline, they heard wisdom. They leaned in closer, waiting on every pause, because the rhythm itself made the words sound eternal. Even Ralph Macchio was stunned. He had known Morita as a comedian, a man with a sharp tongue and lightning-fast timing. But when Morita slipped into Miyagi's voice, it was like facing an entirely different person. The transformation was startling. Suddenly calm, almost meditative, his words dropping like pebbles into a still pond. Daniel, jittery and full of nervous energy, would stumble through his lines, and Miyagi's voice, spare, broken, yet steady, would slow the air around them. Their rhythms didn't clash, they completed each other. Still, the studio had doubts. Was it too much? Would audiences laugh for the wrong reasons? Morita worried too. He wasn't blind to Hollywood's history. Accents had so often been used as tools of ridicule. But he made a choice. If he rooted Miyagi's voice in dignity, in truth rather than parody, then the audience would feel the difference. And he was right. What emerged on screen was not a stereotype, but a man whose voice became inseparable from his spirit. The pauses, the broken grammar, the halting rhythms, they weren't weaknesses. They became part of Miyagi's charm, his humor, his quiet strength. Off-screen, Morita's natural voice flowed easily, smooth and charismatic, nothing like the Miyagi cadence. That contrast stunned fans when they first saw him in interviews. The man they thought spoke in fragments revealed himself to be eloquent, quick, and witty. And in that very contrast lay the brilliance of Pat Morita. Miyagi's voice wasn't a gimmick, it was a choice,
one that elevated the character from the risk of stereotype to a symbol of wisdom and heart remembered for generations. They could hardly wrap their heads around it. The man standing in front of them, polished, witty, quick with a story, sharp with a joke, was the same man who once told a generation of kids, wax on, wax off, in that halting, broken staccato. It felt impossible. But that was the brilliance of Pat Morita. His gift wasn't just acting, it was transformation. He slipped into Miyagi's skin so completely that people forgot it was a performance at all. That voice wasn't simply an accent, it was a creation, a mask so convincing it became its own living presence.
Soon, it was everywhere. Kids mimicked it on playgrounds, adults remembered it as a shorthand for wisdom. Comedians parodied it on late-night stages. But beneath all the echoes of humor and imitation, there was always weight. Because Marita had given Miyagi more than a funny cadence. He had given him dignity, warmth, and heartbreak in equal measure. Still, the irony was sharp. The very voice that saved his career, that made him unforgettable, also chained him to an image he could never fully escape. For Pat Morita, the Karate Kid wasn't just a movie role. It was a rebirth, a second act after years of rejection and typecasting. The world would always talk about crane kicks, about wax-on lessons, about Miyagi's quiet wisdom. But Morita himself carried something different. Memories etched not in applause, but in silence. Moments from the set that stayed with him long after the camera stopped rolling. These were his treasures. One stood above all. The night shoot for the now legendary drunk Miyagi scene. The studio nearly cut it. Executives argued audiences wouldn't accept their noble mentor exposed in such raw vulnerability. Broken, mourning the wife and child he lost in an internment camp. But Morita refused to let the moment go. He fought for it, believing it was the soul of the character. When the cameras rolled, he gave everything. Stumbling, slurring, crumbling under invisible weight. He bared Miyagi's sorrow with such naked honesty that the entire set froze. No applause, no chatter, just silence. Heavy, unspoken, and reverent. That night, Morita proved to himself, and to everyone else, that he wasn't just a comedian. He was an actor who could pull tears from stone. Another memory was quieter, smaller, but no less meaningful. The catching the fly with chopsticks gag. On paper, it was just a joke, a throwaway bit of light comedy. But Morita turned it into something textured. He played it with laser focus, almost childlike. His hands steady, his eyes narrowed, the moment stretched into something larger than itself. And when Daniel suddenly succeeded instead, what spilled out wasn't just scripted laughter, it was real, warm, shared. Marita loved that scene. To him, it showed something essential. Miyagi wasn't only a teacher, he was human, playful, competitive, surprised, and alive. The bond Pat Morita shared with Ralph Macchio was more than just a working relationship. It became one of his most cherished memories. Ralph was still just a teenager when they were filming The Karate Kid, balancing the whirlwind of sudden fame with the pressures of carrying a major role. Morita, older and far more experienced, naturally stepped into a protective role behind the scenes. He wasn't only Miyagi on camera, he became a mentor in real life too, guiding Ralph with gentle humor, life lessons, and the kind of wisdom only time could teach. Years later, Ralph Macchio would look back on that connection and describe it as the heart of the movie, on screen and off. For Morita, that love and care wasn't scripted, it was real. Every day on set it grew stronger, weaving itself into their performances in ways the script could never have captured. Even the crew, who had started off doubtful, wondering whether the funny man from Happy Days could ever embody a character like Miyagi, began to see something shift. Their skepticism faded day by day. By the time the iconic tournament scenes were being filmed, even the stunt team, tough and unflinching, looked at Morita with genuine respect. To them, he wasn't just playing a sensei, he was one. That respect stayed with him long after the camera stopped rolling. And part of that transformation came from the little rituals Morita created between takes. he'd slip into Miyagi's voice not for the audience, not for the director, but to ground himself in the role. Sometimes he'd mutter bits of advice in that broken English cadence, half serious, half playful, as though Miyagi himself was speaking through him. Soon, crew members would actually seek him out, laughing and joking that Miyagi was giving them life lessons while waiting for the next scene to be set up. For Marita, those moments were priceless. Miyagi wasn't just alive on the script's pages, he was alive in the hearts of everyone who worked with him. Looking back, Marita realized it was those small, authentic moments, the laughter, the silences, the chemistry that gave the Karate Kid its soul. The crane kick would become legend, yes, but what he truly carried with him were the friendships, the bonds formed in the quiet corners of the set. And near the end of his life, when he reflected on it all, it was clear. Mr. Miyagi wasn't just a character he played, he was a gift that shaped Pat Morita as much as he shaped it. And in his final reflections, Marita acknowledged something profound. The Karate Kid didn't just give him a role, it gave him the chance to be remembered not merely as a comedian who got a lucky break, but as a true artist, someone who poured his soul into a character that touched the world.